What's your opinion on Russia potentially being bold enough to think they could minimally strike the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant by creating a massive disaster instead due to sheer incompetence, which they are famous for? My position up to this point has been, if something happens at a nuclear power plant, I think the biggest risk is their incompetence. Because when I was there, I saw shells blowing up very close to the power plant. We were getting reports of them mining the area and possibly the inside. We were getting videos from the inside of the power plant of them storing Russian military equipment in the buildings of the power plant. But now, given all the reports we're getting from Ukrainian intelligence, giving Russian statements about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and looking at the totality of the evidence around the Novokakhovka dam explosion, I am more concerned that the Russians might feel emboldened enough to think that they could cause a nuclear incident and not be breaking the nuclear taboo on the world stage, or the world will not react to them as if they broke the nuclear taboo if they have enough plausible deniability and they could frame it in a certain way. That is what concerns me more than anything, because I don't think that they're just going to nuke Ukraine and say we did it. I don't think that they're going to use a tactical nuclear weapon or something like that. And the reason I don't think that is because the nuclear taboo would create such a backlash that even their economic support systems that are currently held up by the Chinese, the Indians, and other trade partners that continue to do business with them and continue to accept Russian energy exports, which the profit on Russian energy exports have dropped by more than 50% since before the war due to European sanctions. So anytime somebody tells you the sanctions don't work, when Russian government revenues are picking up the biggest deficits they've seen in decades, and we actively see their profits going down. If they were to break the nuclear taboo, like 50% is already bad. But imagine it turns to 70%, 80%, 90%, because the Chinese and the Indians both have good reasons for not wanting to break the nuclear taboo. The Chinese don't want to embolden the North Koreans. The mad dog on the Korean peninsula, make them start going crazy, think they can get away with something similar. And you know what? They might be crazy enough to try. And the Indians, for good reason, don't want to embolden the use of nuclear weapons because of their ongoing conflict with the Pakistanis. But that's just, I mean, that's like on a basic level, on an immediate level. There's also a larger, broader level of, you know, China doesn't want the world to blow up. Nobody wants there to be gigantic humanitarian disasters, or at least the majority of people do, unless they're warmongering monsters. So I think that if Russia was to try to pull something like this off, the only way they would do it is if they can deny it, just like they have in so many other instances where they've done a similar, I don't know how you guys use the word terrorism, but I would say terror attacks or a campaign of terror. Anyway, where were we? Let's get into the actual, there's no proof in blowing up the world. There's no profit in blowing up the world. Well, yeah, there's no profit in blowing up the world. That is true, but that doesn't mean that human error can't compound a bad situation and make it worse. For example, let's say the Russians believe they can get away. Okay, let's draw out a scenario here. And I'm not saying this is the likely scenario, and I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying this is a scenario, and I don't think it's 100% impossible. Let's say the Russians, after blowing up the Novokakhovka dam and creating a man-made disaster, which we don't know 100%, but the totality of the evidence does seem to point in a certain direction. And so, for a moment, let's say that the totality of the evidence is correct and that they blew it up. So, they blow up the dam. They get away with it. There's no real international backlash. They even shoot at the rescue workers afterwards, which I documented personally. They get away with it. They see that, and they see the small layer of plausible deniability that is over it, that has caused the international community's response to be somewhat muted. Maybe there is something to be said about the international community's Ukraine fatigue and that they didn't react that decisively to it. And so they get the idea that they can do things like that in the future and also get away with it. Straining the Ukrainian economy, straining the Ukrainian will to fight, and also making it more difficult for the Ukrainians to engage in armored operations. If there's flooding in the area downstream of Novokakhovka, can't really do a river crossing if the area is flooded, right? If there's radiation out of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, that could also complicate Ukrainian operations. But for whatever reason, they decide to go through with it. And they pull the trigger using a layer of plausible deniability. Now, Ukrainian intelligence has suggested that if the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant blows up, that what they're going to do is they're going to plant explosives on the roof of the power plant, explode them, in a larger disaster to try to make it look like they were struck by artillery, and artillery destroyed the power plant, and that it was the artillery that destroyed the largest power plant in Europe and caused a nuclear disaster. That's what Budyov, the head of Ukraine's intelligence chief, that's what he said, right? This is something that Zelensky has also gone out and said in one of his presidential addresses as well. So if they go through with that, and that's what they do, how does the West respond? You've got radiation leaking into the Dnieper River because it's right on the Dnieper River, making the flooding situation even worse, not because it's added to the flooding, but now the flood waters that are traveling all the way down to Odessa are now irradiated. All the locals, they have to deal with radiation. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Commission, with the few monitors that they have there, they're going to be in a complete panic, right? They're going to be in a panic. They're going to be blowing the air horn as hard as possible. Due to the nature of it being the largest power plant, nuclear power plant in all of Europe, it's going to create some amount of a reaction from the West. The West will need to respond, and in their minds, they will 100% need to respond, because if they don't, then if they know the Russians did it, they're allowing them to engage in nuclear terrorism with no response, with no consequences. What does that say to the North Koreans? What does that say to this group? What does that say to that group? That Russia can engage in nuclear terrorism and get away with it. And so the United States will have to respond. Now, Lindsey Graham and other senators have suggested that if they do this, that the Russian military will be like annihilated in Ukraine. Can we actually get their statement on this? Can we actually get their statement on this? I'm sorry I'm deviating from my main news stories, but what the hell is this? Kanye West and the LA, you know what? Why is all of these things that I'm getting recommended? Anyway, what was I looking up? I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, Lindsey Graham, Russia, ZNPP. Let's see if it comes up. Where is it? This is a recent thing. He said in like a press briefing. Oh yeah, I forgot Russia also issued an arrest warrant for Lindsey Graham. I forgot that. No wonder he hates them so much. But where is it? Well, anyway, I can't find it right now. But I think like a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, Lindsey Graham said something along the lines that we're gonna like annihilate the Russian army. And while I don't necessarily think that if this was to happen, the American military would try to annihilate the entirety of the Black Sea Fleet or the entirety of the Russian military, there's a decent chance that there would be a direct military response. That the American government and American politicians like Lindsey Graham and others would suggest that the only way to truly deter people from doing this in the future, the only way to draw a clear red line in the sand with the Russians, is to respond to them with force for engaging in nuclear terrorism. And that we asked the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear arsenal, and we signed the Budapest Memorandum, and now, less than 2 decades later, I think 2 decades or almost 3 decades later, the Ukrainians are having nuclear terrorism done on their soil. There has to be a strong response to this. We have to uphold the commitments we made during the Budapest Memorandums, and we need to discourage this type of behavior in the future, not only in Ukraine, but for the whole world. And so then the president will most likely be given a list of options that will include a military response. Now, I doubt more sanctions. There's other options they could do, but I doubt the response is, if they know the Russians did it, we got to sanction them more. I'm sure they could find something to sanction, whether it be like gold shipments or just find something, but there's no way that would be it. I think that it would include whatever the response would be. Would probably include not only more military aid to Ukraine, maybe an approval of ATACMS long-range missiles, maybe approval of other types of shipments of munitions, which will make the Americans and the West, I think, double down on support to Ukraine and not scare us off from supporting them. If that was the intention of such a strike or operation from the Russians, I think that would terribly backfire. But on the other end, I think that there's a really decent chance for a military strike, whether it would be on, say, the Black Sea Fleet and they would try to sink a few ships, whether it would be specifically targeted on the people who organized the Russian like nuclear terrorism. Like they find out who did it, they find out the unit or the military division that did it, and they blow them up and they kill a bunch of their soldiers directly with like US stealth bombers or something. I don't know. Or maybe it would be a wider operation, you know? Maybe John Bolton gets a little giddy and maybe Elliot Abrams gets in the ears of the president. It's a wider operation. Who knows? But there is a real possibility for military response. And once there's a military response, who knows what the Russians are going to do? Because in one hand, oh, somebody just posted the Lindsey Graham video.
Senator Graham, after that very newsworthy press conference. Yeah.
I don't think this is it. But we could still listen to it. This is not the video I was talking about. It was during a press conference, and he had another Republican next to him, also like backing him up on it. I forget which Republican it was, but I guess we can watch this too. It might actually be. Is that the Republican to his left? I don't know. I don't know who that is. Maybe I just see all white men in suits. It's the same guy. I don't know. Very bigoted against the white people. Okay, let's watch.
Yesterday, the Russian ambassador came out and accused you and Blumenthal of essentially inciting nuclear war. How do you respond to him?
Well, Dick and I didn't move any tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. So the bottom line is Putin is playing a game. Every time we want to send any weapon, that's going to be World War III. You know, if you send in tanks, that's a new game. If you do the HIMARS, every time we try to help Ukraine evict the Russians, they threaten the West. Here's what I think is real. According to President Biden, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon by Russia is becoming a more real scenario as Ukraine gains momentum on the battlefield. So I'm letting the Russian generals know, if you follow the order of Putin to blow up the nuclear facility, the plant, to irradiate Europe, or you drop a tactical nuclear weapon to turn around the war you're losing, I consider that an attack on NATO, and Senator Blumenthal, a Democrat, agrees.
Okay, so it was a Democrat. I think it was Blumenthal, or was it Dick Durbin? I don't know. Either way, this is the same sentiment that he expressed in the press conference, so I guess playing this was useful. Now, some of you might be confused as to the reasoning as to why he would want to strike. Now, I do think the reasoning is deeper than what he just gave. I think the reasons of deterrence, like the idea that you don't want to encourage this type of behavior, don't let the Russians think they can get away with this, don't let other people think they can get away with this, supporting the Ukrainians more is already a priority of the American government at the moment. But I also think that when he talks about NATO and using Article 5, seeing this as an attack on NATO, he's not saying that Ukraine's part of NATO, which I've seen a few people misinterpret his statement like this, and they're like, what are you talking about? It's not in NATO. From what I've seen is the argument is that if there was an attack or disruption or some sort of bad scenario happening with the ZNPP, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe, that radiation, there's a decent chance it's not just going to stay in Ukraine. The damage, most concretely, will be felt in Ukraine. It'll be felt by the locals, some of which I've interviewed. I actually did a piece on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV, covering this issue. I released it probably 6, 7, 8 months ago now, maybe 10 months ago on my main channel. If you guys want to go check it out, warning about this exact scenario. But the idea is that radiation could spill over and head towards Romania or head towards Poland, or head towards some other states that are close to Ukraine. And therefore, since the effects of this attack on, again, the largest nuclear power plants in Europe could be felt in those other countries, that can be seen as an attack on NATO. That is the argument. Now, whether the Russians will believe that, and it would trigger Article 5, I think it triggering Article 5 is extremely debatable. I think odds are it probably wouldn't trigger Article 5, but that does not mean it would not trigger a direct intervention to some extent by NATO nation states. The bombing of, say, the Russians that directly did this. And once you've got that type of direct military confrontation, while the odds are that the Russians probably would not immediately escalate, as in, wow, the Americans struck our soldiers in there after we did nuclear terrorism. Let's go strike American soldiers in Poland. Let's go kill American soldiers in Romania. Let's go do this in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The odds of them escalating past that point, while not impossible, are low, in large part due to the fact that if the Russians are having a problem in Ukraine, how are they going to trigger a war with NATO and win that? How are they going to risk a direct military confrontation with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the United Kingdom, Poland, France, Germany, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hungary, and all these other nation states that they probably don't want to fight? If they can't beat the Ukrainians, how are they going to beat all these nation states? How are they going to do that? And so the odds of it escalating are low, but considering Putin's position right now, definitely when he doesn't look as powerful as he could at the moment due to the Wagner coup, I don't think it's impossible that he rolls the dice and maybe he doesn't attack American soldiers in Poland, or maybe he tries to attack near the American embassy in Kiev, or maybe he tries to attack any of our advisors that are in the area. Or maybe he tries to assassinate Zelensky again and completely avoids retaliating directly against the Americans. Maybe there's a cyber attack. Who knows? But that is a possibility. That can spiral out of control depending upon Putin's response. What's this? What have I been sent in site chat? Xi Jinping personally warned Vladimir Putin against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, indicating Beijing harbors concerns about Russia's war, even as it offers tacit backing to Moscow, according to Western and Chinese officials. This is not surprising at all. This isn't surprising. Again, the Chinese do not want the nuclear taboo to be broken. Nobody in the world wants the nuclear taboo to be broken, except in some circles in Russia. Not all circles, by the way. That's something I also want to comment on. There's a lot of oligarchs that would be terrified if something was to happen at Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and even more terrified if the Russians were to directly and clearly use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There's a lot of people who would be absolutely terrified by that. Not only oligarchs, but also those in the Russian MOD, private military companies, like all across Russian society. They'd be terrified of that, right? If we're already seeing the cracks form around Putin over military contracts with Wagner, it's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be more cracks or even more strain placed upon the system if he was to try something like this, possibly even a breakdown of the system. And I know that used to sound crazy, but considering recent circumstances, I don't think that's, particularly outside of the realm of possibility. Let's see if I can read this. See if this is going to be pay locked. Oh, it's not pay locked. Okay, let's read it. Xi Jinping warned Vladimir Putin against nuclear attack in Ukraine. Chief Chinese officials previously take credit for convincing Russian leader to back down from veiled atomic threats. I do want to bring up this Political report, and I don't know if I'm the only one that ever mentions this. I haven't seen any other. Well, I think maybe I've seen it mentioned once or twice, but I definitely haven't seen other people mention it in the YouTube, Twitch streamer space. Maybe it's because I'm just a super nerd. But Politico produced a report about a year ago saying that American and Chinese officials had secret negotiations to try to slow down America, like quote unquote, escalating the war, or at least how that's talked about in the narrative of escalation, with tanks and stuff like that. That they agreed that if America doesn't go balls to the wall in Ukraine, essentially, right? That's me dumbing it down. That they would have their Chinese military officials who did training operations with Russian military officials privately and discreetly go to those Russian military officials and be like, yo, dog, I know Putin's like the top G or whatever. He's like your guys, Andrew Tate, you guys love him, but don't blow up the world. Please understand that it'd be bad for Russia. It'd be bad for China. It'd be bad for the whole world if you blew up the world because his war started to fail, or that, his rule started to get challenged. Maybe you shouldn't do that. That was something I was reported on by Politico, I think a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. Forget how long it's been since those secret negotiations were revealed. But I wonder how much those negotiations still have an effect, or if they're still in place. Because I know that American support for Ukraine has heightened since then, with tanks being shipped, Abrams, they're in the process of being shipped. I don't think the Abrams have not actually arrived in Ukraine. And that's the funny thing when people talk about aid to Ukraine. We've given them all this aid, but they haven't won. Maybe half of it has actually arrived, right? Maybe half of it. And the numbers that people are putting out constantly are bloated and include replacements for the U.S. military, meaning we're adding to the total number of aid sent equipment we never even sent to them, right? That's how you get these crazy ass numbers of like 120 billion in military aid. Just completely made up nonsense. Anyway, let's read more of this article. I'm rambling. I'm a rambler. I'm like Waylon Jennings. Xi Jinping personally warned Vladimir Putin against, personally I don't know why I didn't read that earlier. That didn't click with me. Oh my gosh. Personally, that's a lot more than discrete generals, huh? And remember, Russian energy profits for the state have gone down by 50%. Russian revenues have gone down by 50% for the government, and their tax revenue is hurting. Their energy revenue is hurting, and their military expenses have gone up, and by some projections, up of a measure of 200 to 300%. And China is one of the few countries, even though they're buying Russian energy exports at a discount, they cannot make up the totality of those Russian energy exports that they used to send to Europe, not only because they have other sources and they can pull from other sources, and Russia doesn't really have China by the balls. I think it's more the other way around. Not only because of that, but also because a lot of the infrastructure isn't in place. I think some people maybe have like a cartoonish, like you just take a bunch of oil and you just put it into like drums and then you put it in the back of a car and you just kind of drive it over, and that's how the oil trade works. A lot of it is done by pipelines and pipeline construction. Pipelines are super integral for the oil and natural gas industry. And there's just a lot more energy infrastructure for the export of energy in Russia going to Europe than there is from Russia going to China. So even if China wanted to buy all of the Russian energy, not at a discount, at the same rate that they were buying it from Europe, that Europe was buying it from Russia, which they weren't going to do that at all, because the Chinese, of course, have their own interests at hand. If they can if they can save a pretty penny, they're going to try to save a pretty penny. But but essentially right now, the Chinese and the Indians and others are making up this fall, or trying to make up some of this fall, even though, it's helped somewhat, but it hasn't been able to make up a lot of the energy, export deficit. I don't know if I'm going to call it deficit, but the fall in revenues. If Russia was to piss off China enough, so they would say, you know what, we are going to agree to the price cap on Russian energy exports. So you know what, we're not going to buy that Russian energy export. Then we're looking at, instead of a 50% cut in profit, we're looking at 60, 70, 80% cuts. And we're just talking about China here. But this would be a disaster for them. So Xi Jinping personally warning Putin is fantastic news. Xi Jinping personally warned Vladimir Putin against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, indicating Beijing harbors concerns about Russia's war even as it offers tacit backing to Moscow, according to Western and Chinese officials. The face-to-face message was delivered during the Chinese president's state visit to Moscow in March. The people added, one of Xi's first trip outside of China after years of isolation under his zero COVID policy. Since then, Chinese officials have privately taken credit for convincing the Russian president to back down from his veiled threats of using a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. Deterring Putin from using such a weapon has been central to China's campaign to repair damaged ties with Europe, said a senior advisor to the Chinese government. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has placed Moscow and its ally Beijing at odds with much of the continent. China has constantly opposed the use of weapons in Ukraine in its public statements, but many of Kiev's backers have doubted Beijing's commitment to such deterrence, given Xi's no-limits partnership with Putin and a peace plan that heavily overlaps with Russian talking points. Xi's warning, however, has given them hope that China is backing up its public rhetoric behind closed doors and potentially threatening consequences for their relationship that would be sufficient to stop Putin from using a nuclear weapon. The Chinese are taking credit for sending the message at every level, a senior U.S. administration official said. Another interesting part about, wait 1 second, we'll read maybe like one or two more lines. Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, said in March that Xi's visit reduces the risk of nuclear war and that the Chinese have made it very, very clear. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not immediately respond to a request for comment, but a former government official confirmed that Xi told Putin personally not to use nuclear weapons, noting that China's stance against their use was included in its position paper on peace in Ukraine. The Kremlin did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Something that's interesting here, and I think this would make it even more difficult for the Chinese to back down if the Russians did go through with this, is now that the Chinese are taking credit for it, and now that in private conversations and some public statements and other stuff that is getting out and leaking to the press, and that they're bragging about on the home front, most certainly, if the Russians then did go through with the use of a nuclear weapon, not only would it be bad for the breaking of nuclear taboo, not only would the Chinese have, security reasons why this would be very terrible, and it would hurt their image on a basic level if they were to continue to finance a regime that actually went through with such a crazy move. But also, it would just be embarrassing. It'd be embarrassing if I said, hey, look, my main success in office is to stop an invasion of Hawaii. I stopped it. No one's going to invade Hawaii. And then a few months later, someone's, invades Hawaii. That's pretty embarrassing. It's pretty, ugh. It kind of tarnishes the legacy pretty hardcore, doesn't it? So if anything, the more public this gets, the more entrenched the Chinese position against the use of these weapons are, and the better it is in the long run. This is good news. This is really good news. This is fantastic news, actually. I wonder if I should continue to read this. You know what? I'll read a little bit more. I'll nerd out with the rest of you guys before we move on to all the other segments. Putin was left disappointed after Xi's visit failed to yield any tangible wins for Russia, such as approving the long-awaited Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. See, this is what I was talking about. They need the pipelines in place if China's going to make up that energy deficit. Western security officials said. The combination of the use of nuclear weapons in the joint communique was almost certainly added at China's behest, the officials said. Russia's invasion is heavily reliant on support from China, which has helped Moscow to navigate economic sanctions that have excluded it from critical global markets and supply chains. Last year, China's bilateral trade with Russia reached a record $190 billion as Beijing ramped up purchases of Russian energy and enabled it to import crucial technology, including microchips. Super important, as the Russian microchip industry isn't exactly booming, and now that the Europeans and other powers won't export them to them, they need them for the long-range targeting missiles, the accurate stuff, the stuff that can, actually hit something from a long distance. They need it for the type of technical equipment that's going to be necessary for them to win the war. And so they have been trying to find every way they can to get microchips from other areas. I think they've even found a few Iranian ones, unless I'm mistaken, and I'm just thinking about the innards of drones. China has refrained from criticizing Russia for the invasion and has accused the West of fueling the conflict by supplying arms to Ukraine. Beijing has also made thinly veiled references to damaging acts of hegemony, domination, and bullying by the U.S. via sanctions. We're bullying the people filling up mass graves. That's very mean of us. I didn't mean to bully the war criminal. I didn't mean to bully the people, filling up the largest mass graves in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides. I didn't want to bully those people. I didn't want to make it so they can more easily buy their weapons. How foolish. How foolish of me. A Russian nuclear strike on Ukraine, or one of its European allies, would risk turning the continent against China, the advisor said, while sustained pressure from Beijing to prevent such an act might help improve relations with the continent. Shin Yinhong, professor of international relations at Renmin University in Beijing, said that Russia has never and will never have China's approval for using nuclear weapons. If Russia used nuclear weapons against Ukraine, China would further distance itself from Russia. Xi's warning against China remained worried about the war, despite assurances from Putin last October that a tactical nuclear strike would not make any political or military sense. Okay, that's enough of this article. That's enough. Good article, though. And good news. Very good news, actually. Fantastic news. Didn't you know that Russophobia is the new anti-Semitism? I was uninformed. I must be living in ignorance. I've been living in ignorance. Look at those bullying. Look at those bullying. Our bullies. Bully them harder. Bully them harder. Hi, Dylan. Oh, hey, Shaved. How you doing, man? Hope you're doing well. Okay, what do we got next? What do we got next that we finished? That wasn't even a segment today. I already talked about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant on my last video. It was released on my second channel. We talked about it last stream. That wasn't even supposed to be a segment today, but you guys just got me so caught up in it. Dylan, I just got home. If you didn't go full screen at the start, you're getting eyeliner.